Welcome back to another episode of the Trees and Lines podcast. We are back with Robert Brewer in part two of our two-part episode. We discuss implementation of smart grid technology, how the economy has affected his business, and how they are giving back to their customers. Have a listen. Hope you enjoy.
How many customers do you serve? Sorry, Phil.
So it's a distribution utility, about 33,000 distribution customers. On the water side, we have about 30, so we're a full water utility as well, about 30,000 water customers here, just here in Sault Ste. Marie. We also have a company that we acquired about 5.5 years ago that operates throughout Ontario, doing managing water and wastewater plants for municipalities across Ontario and First Nations. We've also now launched a water main lining company. There's another thing we created where we actually put a pipe within a pipe using some robots. You send down pipes and they come back and they put a polymer on the inside of an aging water main, which gives about an extra 40, 50 years of life to that water main. So
Wow.
There's some really neat things going on. We're doing that everywhere. The transmission stuff is pretty much everywhere. It's not geographically constrained. The biggest project we have on the go right now is here in Sault Ste. Marie, which is the first one. But so lots of different things. But yeah, it started out as a pretty modest sized local utility.
So you mentioned your smart grid system. Mm-hmm. Is that something you're just beginning to implement, or?
No, we've completed it now. So that was about I think when I started here, there'd been some discussions for a number of years, and there's a way to. It wasn't a way yet where it was cost effective, where we didn't have a significant bill impact. And so one of the things we were able to do was we were able to rationalize it a little bit in terms of the size. We were able to get some funding through NRCan, and we were able to implement the project without actually increasing the customer's total bill. So their commodity went down, their delivery went up a bit, but it netted out. And so it's a project where we implemented voltage optimization across the entire platform. So that allows us to give energy savings roughly about 3% across the board. And at the same time put distribution automation into the system using that same platform. And so distribution automation is where the grid self-heals. So when you have an outage, it identifies exactly where the fault is, isolates just that fault rather than the entire circuits being off, and restores everybody else within seconds. And so we've seen some significant storms since then, and it's been phenomenal in terms of the decrease in the number of outage, especially the timing of outages, how long they've been. So it's really been successful. And it was the first of its kind to kind of in a novel way bring those things together. First of its kind in Ontario, and I think in North America. I don't think we've seen another similar one where it was community-wide like this.
Everywhere you go, people are talking about resiliency, and it seems like that's what you've addressed.
Yeah, it's you're trying to address it on a number of fronts, right? Like the tree front certainly is a huge one. I mean, I think what we're seeing here is, increase in storms, increase in the number of trees coming down. So we need to build up some significant storm hardening type buffers with respect to our trees. But we also need systems that can intelligently respond, either to tell our crews where to go, which quickens the restoration, or that can identify the fault and restore everything else. Like, why would you have the entire circuit off if you've only got, a span that's an issue, right? And so, it certainly is a major focus, and we've tried to be ahead of this one. So we've been working on this for a bit.
Do you engage with some of the larger utilities across Canada? Like, do they come to you and say, "Oh, wow, what you guys have been able to do in a small footprint has been pretty efficient"? Do you help guide, consult them? Do they engage you? Like, how does that look or work?
So one of the things that this created was an opportunity for us to get out and to speak at a number of events. And I think I did my 18th event a couple weeks back where,
wow,
just in terms of, this was a really novel project, right? And the regulatory process was cumbersome, and a lot of lessons learned that we're happy to share. Like it was, but when you can go out and do, and basically we really, modernized our grid and do it without increasing the customer's bill, then that is a phenomenal story, and that isn't one that's normal. And so it's been definitely a conversation piece there for the last couple of years. I think it's been certainly one of the things that we've used to differentiate Sault Ste. Marie a bit too.
You've talked customer, customer, customer throughout this, and I know that's a part of your mission. In fact, I came across your name first when I saw you had received an award, or the company had received an award back in, I don't remember, 2022 or something like that. That was from the Electric Distribution Association for Customer Service. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. I think one of the things we have have tried to instill, and I think a lot of utilities are on the same path, but in the past, as a monopoly, sometimes the focus on customer can get a little further down on the priority list. And I think what I think we've realized, and again, a lot of other utilities have realized as well, is that everything starts with your customer. At the end of the day, they're the ones who pay the bills that keep the lights on here as well as out there. And so, we really need to be focused. It's one of our core values is being customer centric. And it's one of the things that we celebrate internally. That award was huge for us. There's been a number of other customer related awards that we received as well. And it's important for us that we can celebrate that customer relationship is something that is critical to our success. It may be a monopoly, but we want them to want to do business with us. We don't want them to have to do business with us. And I think from all accounts, we're being fairly successful at that. I mean, you always have the odd challenge here and there, but for the most part, I think we've created a culture that prides ourselves on how we treat our customers.
First of all, that's great. I think that's hard to do given that you guys are controlling the market, because that's really a function of self-governance, right? Like, you have to hold yourself to a competitive standard because you're not being pushed necessarily by two or three other players. But speaking of challenges, like in the role that you currently sit, right, as somebody that's, the leader of the organization, like what are some of the things that you're facing that are a little bit complex, whether it's specific to the utility or regionally or project related, finance related? What's on the docket that kind of is putting some pressure on you guys?
Coming back to the customer, I think it's the affordability piece. I think what every utility is faced with is we have this massive transition that's happening. Ontario and Canada in general is probably a little further along the transition than the US is because of a lot of the industrial electrification that's been pushed here, and it's been pushed through funding through the federal government. And the end result is that we're all faced with having to make very significant investments into our grid at a time when affordability has become a real challenge for a substantial number of our customers, right? And so, the smart grid project allowed us to modernize our grid without raising the bill. Huge. Like that was a huge win. But there are a number of things coming down the pipe where we're going to have to make some very significant investments, and we have to get creative in how we do it, or else the traditional model where it just goes into rate base and then we charge out a return on rate base and it increases the bills is going to cause our customers some significant grief. And so I think the one major struggle on the customer front is how we do that. How do we do that? And just to put it into sort of context for you, we're in the process this is a transmission bill, but we're building a transmission line to connect a steel mill that is going to move from using coal in a blast furnace to using electricity in an electric arc furnace. Okay, they're going to use two electric arc furnaces. Each electric arc furnace uses 150 megawatts. Okay, so it's a 300 megawatt load. The entire city of Sault Ste. Marie in the winter peak is 120. One industrial electrification project, 2.5 times the entire city load. Okay, and there are a number lined up in behind that will be happening in behind that. We're seeing that on a smaller scale with respect to smaller industries that are distribution connected. And we've got to do significant upgrades in order to accommodate those loads. Some of them you could pass on to the new customer, but then now you're in a situation where you're making them in effect pay for your upgrades when really they're driving economic growth. That's not a good fit. It's not a good fit to put it onto rate base and have everybody pay for it because it's not really fair to them either. And so we're in this quandary where we're trying to find that happy spot. And if there was one big challenge, I would say it's that.
I don't know if you can give a little peek into, how you plan on doing that, right? Because there's only so many mechanisms for you to
Yeah.
pay for it.
From the new business perspective or the new development going in or what have you, we're putting in assets that have a 50-year life. I put up a pole, I put up a line, I put up a new substation. It's a 50-year asset. The traditional model doesn't allow me to amortize that over 50 years for that customer when I do the economic evaluation, and it might end up in them paying a capital contribution towards the upgrades. So I think one of the things we're looking at is how do we make that fair, right? And the other piece is that it may make sense for me to actually overbuild some stuff because I know that in the next 5 or 10 years, I've got new loads, new developments, new things coming in. The traditional model where you're always looking backwards, not forwards, which is the way we've tended to do things, doesn't really allow us to overbuild things. But if I overbuild it now, it might cost me an extra 10%. If I overbuild it later, I have to go back and redo it, it's going to cost me 50%. So it's more customer effective at the end of the day if I can think about what I'm going to need in the long term. And so we've been working with a regulatory agency, which is the Ontario Energy Board here, through groups like the Electricity Distributors Association to try to say, look, we really need to look at how this model makes sense here because number one, charging that first mover in a prohibitive way isn't going to facilitate economic growth. Doing it in a way that doesn't allow me to amortize those assets isn't good for them or for my other customers at the end of the day either. And being in a position where I can build knowing what I think I'm going to need rather than waiting until the need is in front of me is a way I can do it more cost effectively and I can team up some of my investments. So those are some of the things we're looking at to try to get there. And it's an all of the above strategy. It's going after the regulator. It's trying to think innovatively and creatively. It's working with your developers to understand where all those future loads are coming from. But it's really putting all those together.
The current mechanism where you can recoup costs is really just the rate base, right? So like, and I'm guessing that's a 3 or 5 year where you're socializing a capital cost over a 5-year period versus a 50-year period. Is that?
No. So where I'm talking about the economic evaluation, it's for that first mover. So you're right. Like when we make capital investments, it goes into our rate base, and based on the type of asset, it has an amortization schedule that the regulator approves. So if I look at a pole, I think it's 40 years or like those sort of things, right? It goes into that. The issue we have is that if I have a developer that's coming in and putting in a new development, then the most I can give them is 25 years, and that's based on a high credit rating. But likelihood is probably sort of 10 to 15 and sometimes 5. And so then what happens is I have to put in a $10 million upgrade. I'm going to make $5 million off it in the first 10 years in terms of the discounted cash flows. And so I've got a $5 million gap that they have to make up as a capital contribution. Well, that's prohibitive to a lot of developers, a lot of developments. And so the asset is not going to be not used and useful 10 years from now. So it really should get put out over the full life of the asset and be fair to the first mover. So that's the first mover penalty in effect that happens. The one on the customer is really just if we continue to just do a reactive based build, then our amount that we have to spend that's going to go into rate base is going to be higher than if we can be proactive.
Oh, so the capital piece is not getting reflected into the rate base.
All of your capital spend goes into your rate base. So if I spend $1, and at the end of the day, my depreciation on my current assets was 50 cents, then at the end of the period, 50 cents goes into rate base, right? And so we're talking 50 million or 100 million or whatever the number is, right? So you have these net additions going into rate base, and then what happens is when you do your rate cases, you get a return on what's in your rate base. So as your rate base grows, the amount required for the return and the debt servicing goes up, and that translates into higher costs on the bill.
You delineated first mover, but it doesn't matter if it's first mover. Any capital work is getting rolled into the rate base, correct?
It is it is in the exactly.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Yeah. Okay, that's pretty interesting. It sounds like you though do have a very constructive relationship with the energy board, right? At least listening to you speak, like it doesn't seem like a contentious relationship. It seems like a productive dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things we enjoy here in Ontario, to be honest with you, is like we have a very effective regulator. I mean, I think like any regulator, they're modernizing, like the traditional model of where the past could inform the future is changing. The future's changing, or what's happening is changing so fast that it's hard to use that model anymore.
Yep.
But they're even reacting to that to an extent. So they're open to suggestions. They still have to be a regulator, so there's still some structure and criteria and all the rest of it. But no, I'd say that I think when you look at other jurisdictions, I think we're very fortunate.
I think about you going from the veg management world to the C-suite, and I can only think about one or two others that I've known from the last 50 years that have done that. So we got a few thousand listeners in the VM world right now, and do you have any coaching advice or guiding principles? What's the entrepreneurial veg management worker that's young, entering the workforce? What would you suggest to him or advise him?
So a trades background is never a bad thing in the utility world. There's a whole lot of tradespeople, and a lot of them do make their way up through the executive ranks. But you need to buttress that with, you have to either understand finance or engineering really well to work in a utility. And so, if you're coming up through veg, you're coming up through lines, you're coming up through station electrician, you understand safety, you understand some of the operational aspect of the business. But the two core things when you move into the C-suite are finance and engineering. And so you need to understand both reasonably well, but one really well. And so I was fortunate on the finance side. That stuff to me comes easy. And so, that was something that I was able to sort of hit the ground running on pretty quick.
I really like the way the Canada market emphasizes the trades background.
Yeah, I think the other nice thing that we have here is there's actually a formal trade for utility arborist. It's it requires schooling. It's a 6,000 hour apprenticeship. It's a formal apprenticeship. And so when you have that ticket, you understand how to safely work around lines, and you understand how to do a quality job. And so you can have confidence that if someone comes to you with a utility arborist ticket, that you've got a solid worker, right, in terms of understanding the hazard and understanding how to do the work properly. So that's one of the things that Ontario is very fortunate. I was actually a part of the group that built that, going back now about 15 years. The utility arborist trade was created because of the need in this industry to understand the hazards and the work that you're doing. And I think that is a huge success. So if there's other people listening that have the ability to create those models within their provinces or states, I think that's one of the successes that we've seen in Ontario with respect to how we keep our workers safe and how we get our work done productively.
On a more broad macro scale, a lot of attention on the political environment in Canada, a struggling economy, lots of issues on a federal level, a currency that's getting hammered. When you look at Canada holistically, how much of that and how much of the political stuff that's the noise and the things that are being legislated, how much of that is affecting your ability, at a provincial level, and then more specifically at a utility level, to function? How much of that part of the world is impacting your day-to-day or your decision-making?
I guess as we look down at U.S. politics and we compare it to Canadian politics,
yeah,
I think sometimes we feel very fortunate to live in Canada.
Okay.
We often think of moving there.
So the swings are very limited. So when we talk about a Liberal Party or a Conservative Party or a New Democratic Party, and party gets in, there's nuanced change. It's not wholesale change. And so from a utility that manages for the long term, we actually enjoy a whole lot of stability at the end of the day. We're very fortunate, I think. I think we've been very well led provincially for a number of governments, but we've seen, some especially in the last sort of 6, 7, 8 years, we've seen a lot of stability around how do we make prudent investments, how do we do the right thing by our customers as a provincial focus. And so I think one of the things that I would, to sort of turn your question is I think it's actually a benefit that we've seen with our government politically, that number one, we've got a provincial government that's been really focused on making energy affordable. That's been one of their really major focuses since they took office, and that was 6, 7 years ago.
Yep.
And federally, we've got a government that is looking to say, how do we try to navigate this transition in a way that protects the environment, protects people, does it in a way that rather than having them kicking and screaming, does it in a way that we can sort of nudge it along with some dollars flowing into some good paths. And then the steel mill here is a classic example, right? So they made that transition, and in doing that transition, they got some funding. It helped them through it. Absent that funding, I don't know if the business case was there, but it certainly was with it. And so they are spending $1 billion, we're spending 200 million, and we're taking the equivalent of 1 million cars off the road. That's what that project does. It's massive. But it doesn't happen without governments taking those positions, right? So I think to answer your question, I think one of the things, and I have a number of friends down in the U.S., and they always look at us and say, you got subsidized healthcare, you got all this, you got that, all these things are bad. And I would just counter that. I think what it does is it's created some stability. Like we know what the rules of the game are. We know what healthcare costs us. It doesn't change a lot year to year. We don't have these massive changes, massive swings. Government policy is fairly stable. Government to government, there's not these huge swings. Like there's minor nuance change. And it creates an environment that allows us as a utility to plan for the 30, 40, 50 years out, which is how we have to do things. When we put a pole in the ground, it's there for 50 years. When we build a substation or a transmission station, it's there for 50 years. We're making millions and millions of dollars in investments, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in investments that we won't recoup all of for 30, 40, 50 years. So we better make good bets. And having a stable environment, I think, has helped that. So I don't know if I fully answered your question. I maybe spun it around on you, but I think at the end of the day, I think it's a benefit here.
Interesting. And this is probably a tough thing for you to answer. Your footprint is fairly small, right? Serving sub 50,000 customers. But what you guys have done is such an excellent model for something that can be done on a bigger scale. I just wonder if, I was sitting down with the CEO of Hydro One, right? Yeah. Are they more impacted by, is it a struggle for them because everything on a scale is just the projects are more expensive, the politics are bigger, the regions are more, far-reaching, just because from our lens, especially for me, who has assets and family in Canada, and I kind of track the politics, the currency, how Canada's faring on a more of a global stage, from our eyes, not necessarily from a socialized healthcare perspective, because I absolutely see the benefit of that, more just how the country has done on a global level. I would say it's somewhat been on a decline, right? From a economic perspective. So I don't know. I just wanted to kind of, as somebody who's leading an organization, lives in Canada, and is building infrastructure, I just wanted to get your perspective, and it's a very healthy perspective. I just was curious what you thought.
Yeah. So I think if you asked, David Leviter at Hydro One, I think I suspect he would tell you that right now there are so many opportunities in the environment. His biggest challenge is how are we actually going to do all the things that we need to do, and how are we going to find the people, how are we going to find the equipment. I mean, you order a transformer now, it takes you 3 years to get it, right? So, how are we going to get all these things done? And it's the same challenge that we have, but certainly his is on a much, much bigger scale. But I think when we look at because we're provincially regulated, the majority of our sort of macro environment is led provincially. Federal government plays an in and out role with respect to funding and things like that. And so those are an issue. The dollar you mentioned, the dollar affects our capital programs. Most of our equipment, long lead time equipment, is going to come from outside of Canada. So if it's coming out of the U.S., then it gets more expensive. But the way a utility works is if you incur costs prudently, then it ends up in your rate base, right? So you get a return on it. So it becomes more of a cash flow, not a P&L issue. And so that's not a huge concern if it goes a few cents, right? So, I mean, if it changed by, something more significant than that, then it becomes maybe a cash crunch, right? But we're not really seeing it from that perspective. It's more the lead times. It's more the access to people. It's more the so many things that you need to get done because there's, a new plant going in and they need to get connected and you've got 5 of them and you only have the capacity to do 4 and you're trying to balance it.
Yeah. Understood. Well, this is an awesome conversation, Rob. I'd heard, I was very much encouraged by probably a mutual associate of ours, Chris Kelly, to engage, think the world of Chris. And I'm glad we sat down and had this conversation. You're doing some pretty amazing things. You've really accomplished an incredible amount, in your territory, but also in building and selling a company, which is fascinating for our audience. Like Phil said, I think a lot of this new crop of young people who are coming in the industry are very ambitious. They're in this space and they've got lots of ideas. There's AI, there's technology. So it's really cool to see what you're doing, and we really appreciate you taking the time today to share some of your story with us. It was pretty awesome.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to do it. And I actually really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you, Rob.
This has been great. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That's it for this episode of Trees and Lines, brought to you by Iapetus Holdings. If you like the show, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. If you have any questions or comments on any of our episodes or ideas for topics or guests, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at treesandlines@iapetusllc.com. We'll chat with you soon.